Great, thank you, Kira.
Continue to try and get the other members on.
Okay. Looks like some of them got on. I know Sue is having trouble and Elise, so if you could keep trying with them. Sometimes they pop up in the attendees list, so if you wouldn't mind checking there too, Kira, we can promote them.
I just have Laura Hughes in the attendees.
Okay.
I got in. Thank you. Thank you.
No,
3 tries.
No problem. For whatever reason tonight, they're like I said, every time WebEx comes out and I have a new community meeting every 2 weeks, they like upgrade it and then everything changes and nobody can get in. So here we are, even though we've all used web.
Every upgrade, it makes it better, right?
Well, for them, not necessarily for us. But yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Laura Arsenault. I'm a Heritage Resources planner with Fairfax County. I'll introduce my team real quick and then we'll take a little bit of attendance just to make sure everybody can hear and see. I took over, as you all know, Nicole Brennan left the county at the end of May, and so I'm kind of taking over in the intermediary until we can get someone new on board, but I'll probably be here for at least a couple months working on this project with you all, and then continuing on with our new planner. So I want to introduce you tonight, Lily Yegazu. She is a senior planner in the Zoning Administration Division. She's working with me on the zoning ordinance amendment for this and the rezoning portions. So any questions for zoning ordinance amendment, she's a specialist in that. I have Kira Davis, who's on limited term position with us, helping me run the meeting tonight. And also one of our new Heritage Resources planners, Grace Davenport. She's a planner 1. She just started at the end of June. So we're bringing her up to speed on Holmes Run Acres and bringing her on board. So with that, I'm going to go through my list. And if you could just, when I say your name, if you wouldn't mind just saying, hey, I can hear you and everything, so we can take it for the record, and then the meeting notes. And then that way we can make sure we can hear you. So let's go down here. I have the call-in user, I think, and I'm sorry, I missed your name at the beginning. I think you asked about if you couldn't see, if you could participate, if you wouldn't mind stating your name and start with.
Patrick Lutali. It's 734-484-4333. Should be the number.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And you can hear us well and everything?
Laura, you're muted.
Yeah, I can hear you fine, but I just can't see anything.
Okay, I shouldn't be muted. I shouldn't be muted. I'll just talk louder. How about that? Next, I have David Heckman.
Laura, you're still muted.
I can hear her.
I'm here. Yeah, I can hear her fine.
I can hear her also.
Kira, can you hear me now? Okay, David Heckman, if you could unmute and just say hi, hello, so we can all hear you.
David, are you there? He's got kids. He may have gotten called away.
He's like me. He was the first one here, just signed on. And then I have Jenny Siegler.
That's me. I'm here.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
Catherine Wallace. She's with our consulting group.
I'm here as well.
Thanks, Catherine. Kay Orr. Hey, Kay, I unmuted you. Okay, we'll come back to Kay in just a minute. I'm Keith Gardner.
Hello.
Hi, Keith. How are you?
Well, thanks.
Good. I have Nancy Guerin. I hope I didn't butcher your last
I can
name.
hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Samantha Huang.
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Hi, Samantha. How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm good. Thank you. Sarah Vonish with Traceries.
I'm here. I can hear you.
Hi, Sarah. And then I have Sue, who I saw pop on.
Laura, can you elevate the other Laura to a participant? Thank you.
Sure.
I can do that, Laura.
Okay, thanks. I think I just did it real quick. So she
Okay.
should be. And then Sue, I know you popped in and said hello, so I think we're good. And then Kay.
Oh, I'm here.
Hi, Sue. Kay, were you able to unmute and say hello? If you ever have trouble chatting or unmuting, if you could type in the chat. I know the Mr. I'm sorry, Mr. Patrick, if you want to, I know it's hard to type in on the phone, but anyone else, if you can't unmute, please try to type in the chat and we'll kind of try to troubleshoot it. Once again, I apologize for all the technical issues, but after doing this for almost a year and a half now, it seems to never get easier. So I apologize for that. So tonight's agenda is going to be very overall basic. The goal for tonight is to discuss the design guidelines. We have our consultants that were introduced a little bit with Traceries, Sarah Vonish, Laura Hughes, Catherine Wallace. That will help answer questions about design guidelines, and I'd like to get a good discussion going on that. So I'm going to give a very brief overview on design guidelines, zoning ordinance, and what goes where in our issues and concerns, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Vonish to give us a short presentation on design guidelines. But the bulk of tonight, I'd like to be discussions and come away with some good feedback for Sarah and Traceries to be able to revise the design guidelines to be more in tune with community goals. So with that, Kira, if you wouldn't mind starting the PDF for me, and I will go ahead and give a brief presentation.
Sure thing. Just give me one moment.
Do you copy me now? This is Kay.
I can hear you, Kay.
Okay, all right.
Let me start sharing my screen. Can you all see that?
Yep. Thank you, Kira. Can everyone else see that? Okay, so just a quick overview. Homes Run Acres, here we are. Kira, next slide. So a brief agenda as I talk about, welcome and introductions, we've already done that. Staff presentation on the zoning ordinance and design guidelines and what sort of issues go where. Then we're going to have a nice design guidelines overview and discussion. And then if there's any public comment, and then talk about not necessarily the next meeting, but next steps after this. So next slide, Kira. All right, so the zoning ordinance. I know this is review for much of you, but we haven't, I know Nicole had let me know we haven't talked about it in a couple months, so it's always nice to get back to the basics on this. So the zoning ordinance is the guiding principle of kind of what we're looking at tonight. The regulations all for the historic overlay district all lie in the zoning ordinance. So any sort of regulatory measures, including heights, and I'll have a graph for you later to look at. But with this, we cannot require actions that are not already regulated by the zoning ordinance. So we can't give the ARB extra powers and oversight to review things. But things that can be considered during this process that would be included in the zoning ordinance would include discussions such as height. If we want to put a height limitation, I think the current building code allows for 35 feet in height for this district. And if we wanted to say do 25 feet or something like that, that was in conformance with the rest of the neighborhood and lent to the significance of the historic overlay district, that's something that we could discuss. Setbacks are another issue that we can regulate in the zoning ordinance. That's a setback from your property lines. So there's front yard setbacks, side yard setbacks, and rear yard setbacks. And so if any of those kind of contribute to the character of the historic overlay district, we can look at that and possibly add some additional regulations to those setbacks. So Karen, next slide. So what does a historic overlay district do? Once again, those regulations lie in the zoning ordinance, and the historic overlay district designation would allow the Architectural Review Board approval before a building permit can be issued, and applies primarily to larger exterior renovations. It does not apply to interior renovations or existing additions that are there now. Those ones that are existing now would not have to be modified. And the underlying zoning remains the same. We're not changing the intensity of the district, and the deeds and covenants are not regulated by the county, so those would remain the same as well. Next slide, Kira. So what is the ARB? We have a couple members of the ARB on the work group, appointed members by the Board of Supervisors with professional expertise in preservation. We have architects, historians, an archaeologist, landscape architect, a lawyer. I know I'm forgetting some, but we have a varied range of preservation professionals on the Architectural Review Board. So they hear and approve the building permits, sign and permits, and then review and make recommendations for rezoning and site plans. Next slide, Kira. Go back up. I think there's one in the middle. Maybe it's not. Oh, never mind. You're right. Go ahead. So the ARB procedure, just wanted to give you a quick overview, and this is just for reference, but you would apply for your building permit or site plan modification. It would go through our building permits group. They would alert Heritage Resources staff, including myself and my team, if it was in a historic overlay district, and you would talk to one of us about whether or not the proposal needed to be reviewed by the entire review board. If it did, you'd submit your application, you'd come to the Architectural Review Board meeting and make a presentation, and then you'd get an approval letter. And then once your building permit was submitted and any changes you had to make, we do a conformance check one more time at the end before the building permit gets approved, or site plan gets approved, and then we move forward and you get your building permit or site plan issued. Next slide. So design guidelines, and I'm just going to touch on this briefly because our consultant's going to touch on this, but these are design guidelines, as previously discussed, are best practices for keeping the style and character of a neighborhood, and are, the most important thing, are recommendations. They kind of give a discussion point and starting point to the Architectural Review Board to maintain the character, but also give the neighborhood and anyone proposing to develop or make an alteration to their house some very specific information about what we would need to keep the character of the modification. Next slide, please. So this is a really, looks very bland, but it's a very important slide where it talks about the different regulations in the county and kind of what goes where. So I'm just going to highlight a couple for you, but the by right uses are what's allowed in the R3 zoning district today. So R3 is 3 dwelling units per acre. And that's the residential uses that you have now. Things such as sheds, the size, height, and location are limited, but you can still have a shed. You can go to Home Depot and get one and plop it back in your yard. Other things include home businesses, home occupations, looking at pools, group homes, and then short-term rentals. And these need some other administrative permits. The building and site plan requirements, that's when kind of Architectural Review Board oversight would come in. Those would include additions, including decks, anything that requires a building permit, demolitions, pools, and then disturbance more than 2,500 square feet of land. That's the trigger for a site plan. So if you decide to do a pool and a deck or a pool and an addition, that would come into us as well. The zoning ordinance regulations is another place where The ARB has some overview, as I talked about earlier, looking at setbacks, the siting of the house on the lot. I know in Homes Run Acres, it's not, the house is not usually parallel to the street. They're set back differently and not the same or parallel at all. Fences, the height and the locations are regulated in the zoning ordinance. And then once again, as we talked about earlier, building heights. So the design guidelines recommendations, these are just some examples of what's included, but it's the architectural features, materials, street views, topography, and fences, including designs and location. And then things that are not regulated by either the zoning ordinance or recommended by design guidelines would be interior modifications, deeds and covenants, and or property value. So that's all private things that would not be affected by the historic overlay district approval. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick it over to Sarah Vonish. I'll come back to the timeline at the end of the meeting, but wanted to kick it over to Sarah Vonish and Trace Rees to give a brief overview on design guidelines and give an introduction.
Thanks, Laura. Should I share my screen or let's see. Oh, I can. Great. Okay, well, it's great to be back with you guys today. And I've received some of your comments on the draft design guidelines, and I really appreciate all the thoughtful comments and attention that was given to the document. So I'm just going to run through a couple slides you're familiar with. Again, just as a reminder, the purpose of the design guidelines, which Laura also touched on, is to provide applicants with recommendations that maintain, strengthen, and enhance the historic and architectural character of this community. They give historical background and practical guidance to facilitate ARB consideration of projects, and they provide flexible guidance that's well aligned with preservation standards and the ARB's review standards. They're not intended to stunt innovative design. They're not meant to be absolute or give case-specific advice. And of course, sometimes a creative, thoughtful approach that doesn't fit within the guidelines will be approved by the ARB. And they really work with the applicants to find a solution to design problems. So our methodology, again, we reviewed existing documentation, we surveyed the neighborhood, coordinated the effort with the overall design guidelines and the other updates to the HOD specific design guidelines. We are consulting with DPD staff and you guys, and in the future we'll be revising the draft and coming back to the work group and the ARB for feedback before it's eventually finalized through the ARB. So I mentioned the general historic overlay district design guidelines that we're also preparing for the county along with the design guideline updates. And these provide an overview of what HODs are and the ARB review process that Laura touched on, and includes discussion of design principles and guidelines that are relevant for all the HODs, including massing, scale, materials, just to provide users and applicants with additional more information on best practices for approaching new work. And so these overall design guidelines will be presented to the public and the ARB for comment in the coming months. So I just wanted you to be aware this is part of an overall comprehensive, design guideline update, and these will also be applicable. Here are just some shots from the overall design guideline contents, the review procedure that Laura talked about, and we have like a checklist for what needs to be submitted as part of the ARB process, which obviously will be very helpful if the HOD is established. So then to the draft Homes Run Acres design guidelines. I don't need to go through this. These are just the contents in the document. The next slides just run through some of the common comments and questions that we received in the emails, and some that I have highlighted for discussion. And at the end, we can bring some more questions and comments and discussion items, but I'll just walk through these. Just as a reminder, the ARB has review standards that are based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. They're in the Fairfax County Zoning Ordinance, and you can see the 12 standards here. And they're also in the document, but the main concept is preserve all the historic features and materials to retain the character of the community. Deteriorated features should be repaired rather than replaced. And new work within the HOD should be compatible yet differentiated from the historic. So these are the work group comments. I'll just touch on them briefly and then we'll go into discussion. So one of the comments that we received was that the document was too long. And I understand the comment that guidelines are meant to be a comprehensive document to really help applicants and the ARB. There is some repetition between the sections in the preservation, new construction, and landscape guidelines to aid users when they're referencing different sections. But it's really meant to be comprehensive and useful and visual for the users based on what the ARB and DPD staff have found needed. So remove all non-recommended photos and or replace.
Sarah.
Yep.
Sorry, Sarah. I don't know if we want to go through one by one and try to discuss them and comment on them because I know we have a couple. Unless you just kind of want to do an overview at the beginning and then.
I think I'll touch on them briefly and then we can come back to any that that work group members want to.
Sorry about that.
No worries, you're fine. The not recommended photos, you know, understanding that, you know, some of the homeowners might find it offensive. They don't want to see their home identified as not recommended. And I understand the reason behind that comment. We really wanted to help users visualize the recommended and not recommended treatments. But, you know, I think in the next draft, we'll just remove the not recommended photos and per the work group comment and reinforce the recommended treatments and photos. So remove any content on work that does not require permit ARB review. So the design guidelines, as Laura mentioned, are recommendations and not requirements, and they are intended to provide guidance as you're preserving your homes and the community to preserve the character of the neighborhood. So there are items that don't require a permit, but still items that affect the character and visual quality of the community. And we believe the guidelines help, and that's what's been included in all the other HOD design guidelines as well. So the Secretary of the Interior standards language, we got a comment to remove that. As I mentioned, the ARB review standards are based on the standards, Secretary of the Interior standards. So they're really provided for a reference for users before they go into the ARB process. And that kind of goes to the discussion of materials. Just as a reminder, here are the standards again. And a lot of these deal with specific materials and finishes and how they should be treated as part of new projects, repair, rehabilitation, or replacement. All right, so content about maintenance recommendations, got a request to remove that. It's included in the appendix as a resource only. We can discuss that at the end, but you know, happy to remove that in the next draft if it's not helpful for the users. Not enough content on massing and scale, need to quantify massing. I think the massing, the setback and height restrictions are really part of the zoning ordinance. The guidelines are really they're not intended to be prescriptive, but help promote compatible designs. So we don't have any specific quantifications, I guess, for the massing or scale. So widening driveways, I have this as a discussion item, so we'll come back to that. Roofing materials allow owners to have more options. I think we can accommodate this in the next draft, and you know, we don't want to provide an exhaustive list of every product, but you know, the overall goal is for any new material that's proposed to be compatible with the building and the historic nature of the community. Solar panels, we'll come back to that, and then the roof pitch angle will come back to that as well. So here's, I mean, if Laura, this is where I kind of envisioned us starting our discussion and opening it up. The first comment that I flagged for discussion was removing all non-recommended photos. We did receive that comment for a couple work group members, but kind of wanted to gauge the desire from the rest of the work group. So I just have some images here of how we helped visualize recommended and not recommended treatments for foundations, wall, and exterior cladding, as well for addition massing.
I've gone back and forth on this discussion. I mean, I saw the comments on it from Jenny and from Edith. I mean, there's sort of, we have to walk that fine line between, you know, calling somebody out as being non-contributing. I like the idea of emphasizing the positives of what we think is good, and, you know, moving towards, you know, not necessarily calling out a house as being non-contributing, because we've already seen a lot of feedback just on previous versions where people are taking exception to whether or not they were considered contributing back in the original assessment. But I do like the idea of emphasizing, you know, what is in keeping. I don't know, I kind of agreed with Edith. You sometimes have to give an example of something that's non-contributing. I had mixed feelings about going outside the neighborhood because everybody would recognize it as not being in the neighborhood. But I think for a positive, I'd say let's focus on what is, you know, sort of conforming or contributing, I should say. And I don't know quite yet what I think about identifying houses as non-contributing. But I do like the emphasis on focusing on the positive. Because people can determine on their own. If they don't see their house looking like the others, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, okay, maybe we're not contributing. They can come to that conclusion on their own.
Just to clarify one point, so this isn't really not contributing or contributing. This is mostly recommended or not recommended treatment. So, you know, some of these houses that have a not recommended treatment might already be contributing. It's just there's a specific design element that might not be recommended or approved by the ARB going forward.
Yeah, so but I guess saying and being sensitive to the topic is that the people will see not recommended and associated with non-contributing. And so it's just the way that trust me, the feedback that we've gotten back in our listserv and stuff like that, people perceive, you know, not recommended as not contributing. And I don't know how to address that in this newer age of where we have to tiptoe a bit. But I think the reality is we should give them examples of what is highly recommended versus, because somebody will recognize their house and have a fit, and then it'll just turn into a nightmare.
This is Keith Gardner. I have a thought on that. Is there any possibility you could use the not recommended photos taken from, say, Holland Hills or another mid-century community?
We thought about that and talked about it. It's just while the Holland Hills houses are mid-century modern, you know, you really have these distinctive unit types within the two neighborhoods. So I don't know if it will actually work out that way. Laura, and you have different development pressures and changes that have happened over time.
Yeah,
thinking of such things as where you focus on a door, you're not recommended could focus on a door and not the whole house. Or if you're focusing on not using stone as a foundation, if you could just focus on the picture, would just focus on the foundation. So you're not showing the entire house.
So you think that in the not recommended photos, the upper two might be fine, while the lower two should probably be cropped, and that could work without offending anyone?
Well, saying is use one from Holland Hills that shows a stone.
Okay.
Because I guarantee even if you cropped it, somebody would recognize that it was their house if it was Homes on Acres. And I really think that is to be avoided if we want to get approval.
I do want to point out a couple things that I've heard. So there will be, we have to determine which properties in the neighborhood will be contributing and non-contributing, and there will be a map of those properties that show which ones are contributing and non-contributing. So that's something that we have to publish with our analysis. So people will know if their house, if we think that their house is contributing or non-contributing. And that's what we're going, we started at the last meeting is going through with you all about discussions of each house, whether or not it's contributing or non-contributing. So at some point there will be a published map of the photo of the properties that are non-contributing. So that is going to be out there and available. And we've gotten some pushback on it from Holland Hills. So we're expecting similar with this because it's not a negative item. It just means that the property has changed enough to mean we don't feel like it's contributing to the neighborhood. And really just makes it a little bit easier to demolish if it comes before the Architectural Review Board. But thank you for pointing that out. We have talked about this issue with Holland Hills as well, about what to do with this. And we even joked about flipping the neighborhoods, like using Homes on Acres pictures for Holland Hills as features that were non-contributing and then flipping them back. And I think we talked about, internally that it might be better, as I think Patrick mentioned, to kind of emphasize the positive and give examples, and then just list the treatments and not necessarily give photographic examples of what we wouldn't want, if that makes sense. So we would say, we want the foundation type to be, and I'm sorry, Sarah, I can't read it, it's kind of small, but we don't want foundation construction clad with stone and stucco, like that type of thing. So we would call that out as a negative and not necessarily include a photo. Are there any thoughts about that approach? Because that way we're reinforcing the positive and not minimizing the negative, but still providing some sort of guidance about what we've seen in analysis about impact on the neighborhood.
I like that approach. Positive imagery of the desired and just text of what's not desired, as opposed to calling out anybody's house.
I think that's a decent solution.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in on the photos, not recommended photos issue?
I think it would be helpful to have not recommended photos from Holland Hills, but if we can't get that, then text is the next best option.
Okay, we'll look at that. And I'm a little concerned about doing that because they're alike but not, and it's we talked about earlier, it's like comparing apples to apples versus apples to oranges. Is they're both modernist communities, but they architecture communities, but they have different impacts and unit types. So let us take a look deeper into that if that's a viable option. But like you said, I think the backup, Jenny, would be doing just the text only for the not recommended or non-recommended treatments.
All right, if no one else has a comment, I'll keep going. So widening driveways, got a comment that it should be allowed since everyone has 2 cars these days. Understand everyone has cars and needs to get around. Here are some of the images of the recommended and not recommended from the design guidelines, but as you can see, the extensive paving can really impact the landscape and natural character of the community and how you perceive the house from the street. So I think we could add some recommendations on how to expand the driveway appropriately without, paving over the front lawn, but we wanted to just help explain where we were coming from when we say avoid expanding your driveway. Does anyone have a comment on this one?
So I probably have a comment on everything. I apologize.
No, that's good.
Patrick.
I appreciate it.
I think really the issue is when, so I agree. I mean, I widened my driveway probably 12 inches on either side, so I don't think it was heinous, but I have a big truck. I think the question starts happening is if you can fit more than 3 cars side by side, you've probably gone too far. 2 side by side, I understand, and and on our driveways are fairly long, so on 2 side by side, you could actually probably fit 6 in our driveways, and it does help alleviate the traffic of getting the cars off the road because our roads are so narrow here. But I don't know what others think. Is it sort of a 2-width car limit issue? Or what? Because I don't know how to calculate a percentage of saying you can't concrete more than, it's not advised to concrete more than 30% of your property. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out whether it's a car width issue or percentage of concrete cover that needs to be addressed.
I've got a question. What does the county have? What kind of guidelines, or how wide can a driveway be? Is there anything like that?
Yes. Is that Lily? I can't see who's.
I was gonna add actually the
Thanks, Lily.
current development standards for the R3 zoning district limit front yard coverage that includes driveways or any paving within the front yard to 30% of the front yard area. And the front yard area is not just the setback area, it's everything between the front property line and the face of the building. So within that area in the R3 zoning district, the maximum coverage is 30%. So you take that rectangle and no more than 30% of that. The curb cut width, though, that's more of a VDOT question. They regulate the curb cut on right between the public right of way and where the property line starts. Anything outside of the property line, the front property line, is not counted in that 30% coverage.
Sarah, could you scroll back up to the overview aerials you had? You had a couple examples. I wanted to, there you go. And these don't have the property lines on them, but I'm wondering if I can.
The third one, it does. Oh, it's not the front yard. I'm sorry. I thought the square
It's
was
just circling the addition.
Yeah. Let's see if I can. I don't know if I can draw on this or not. Anyway, it's the rectangle between the front plane of your house, as Lily noted, and your property line, and it would be 30% of that.
I will look up an example and share my screen.
Oh, good. Thanks, Lily.
Okay.
Perfect.
Do I need to stop sharing for her? Yeah, probably.
No, go ahead until I look it up.
Oh, okay. All right, got it. Okay.
But yes, there are regulations. As Lily mentioned, the curb cut is one thing, which I don't think many people would make wider. The restriction is, as the example Sarah has on screen of, widening it, expanding it kind of after you get in over the curb cut. But really the county doesn't have a regulation other than something we call front yard coverage, which includes driveways, but isn't very indicative of what it would actually mean. But it would be any coverage in that kind of front yard piece. Is there any other comments, or while Lily looks up an example for us, comments that we can discuss on this specific issue? And the coverage, and Lily, please correct me if I'm wrong, includes any impervious area. So the gravel, unfortunately, I think is still considered impervious. And even sometimes pervious pavers, which doesn't make any sense, is still considered impervious. So it's any sort of patio, hardscape, that type of thing. And it's not really dependent on material. It's almost sometimes if it's not grass, that's what's considered front yard coverage. Okay.
I actually do have a question.
Sure.
So you know how there's some, I actually haven't seen local examples of this, but there are things called green driveways where, you know, I don't know if this counts as a permeable paver, but they have these like, you know, sturdy kind of matrices that you fit into the grass and the grass can grow out of it. And then you can actually drive your car over it and park on it, but it looks, it's designed to keep the appearance of grass. Does that count towards like the paved area of your front property or no?
I'm pretty sure it does because it's like a patio. The blocks you're talking about for a driveway, maybe Lily knows the answer to that, but I think it still counts as pervious or impervious as the same.
That is correct. Yeah, it does count towards the front yard coverage. I know we have done interpretations. We do get questions on different types of materials, paving materials within the front yard. And the zoning administrator has historically made determinations that most of them do count. But if it's unique enough that it warrants another review, it will require for the zoning administration to make another determination. It would be case by case.
I think.
Well, on something, but I'm sorry, on something like design guidelines, am I correct that you could not specify that driveways be permeable if you widen them? Is that correct?
So we go back and talking about two different places of how we're recommending and regulating type thing. So if we wanted to regulate the front yard coverage or limit the driveway, we would have to do it in the zoning ordinance through the front yard coverage. And we wouldn't necessarily mention the materials that you were using. Now the design guidelines get into the materials, and it looks like Sarah's listed, you know, straight geometric lines, that type of thing, design. And some, she said paving, not recommended paving driveways with dark asphalt. So you can see it's light asphalt in some of the examples here. So that's where the kind of nuances of where, if we think the coverage is an issue, we would put that piece in the restriction in the zoning ordinance. If we think the materials is an issue, we would make that recommendation in the design guidelines. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That's good to clarify it. Thanks.
And just to add to that, I just looked up another interpretation that was done on a proposal to have a driveway in a front yard with two pavers running and a grass strip in between the runners. And that grass strip area was calculated as part of the front yard coverage. So basically, you know, anything that's in between non-pervious surfaces would also be counted for the purpose of the zoning ordinance.
So it's like it's tire tracks or the like, you know, having the grass strip between the width of the tires type thing. Okay.
All right. So I was just going to suggest that this one might require a little bit more discussion because the zoning already tells you how much you can do. So that's sort of like the maximum limit. If we wanted to restrict it to something else to make it part of the zoning, we would have to do that. Otherwise, it's just a guideline. And
correct.
So this already said, so the discussion really is, do we want to get into, you know, do we want to change the zoning because the historical significance of the neighborhood is not for mega parking spaces, and we say it's going to be a little bit more restrictive than what is currently allowed in the zoning. So it may require a little bit of thought on, because I don't know what the square footage, like I said, you know, I don't know what 30% really looks like. I don't know what, you know, 20% looks like in these houses. And then the guidelines come down to, like you said, you know, new gravel versus black asphalt. I'll just throw it out there on my own. I don't think we should be getting into black asphalt discussions or gravel versus whatever. But I think really the concern would be mega parking structures. And if we think the 30% covered by zoning today is excessive to what the neighborhood actually represents, then I think we should have that discussion.
That's great. Thank you very much for putting that out there. My one caution is that the regulations in the zoning ordinance are binding. So there's no wiggle room if, for example, you need 31% because of the angle of your house sited on the lot. So you have your driveway and a patio, and there's no wiggle room for that. If you have 31% today, that wouldn't be approved. That wouldn't be able to be. That's not in conformance with the zoning ordinance. So just a word of caution that if we limit it to 25% or 20 or whatever, and Lily and I can work on doing some analysis for you and some mock-up examples of, what 30% of your front yard is versus, existing driveway and excessively paved driveway, like some of the examples in these photos, and we can get back to you on that. But what we've seen in other areas is it seems like the 30%, it does an adequate job limiting it. But we can look at that specifically for this district, because if we find a trend, for example, 25% or something like that, but we do hear the concern about the extra large driveways and the overtaking of the front yard. But let us do a little bit of homework and some mock-ups for you, and then we can come back and discuss this at another meeting, just because we don't have that necessarily ready for you tonight.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good idea, because I have no sense of what the homes and homes run acres, what is the current, sort of, or if you, like you said, if most of our houses are sitting at 25%, maybe that's the right answer for here, but I have no idea. But okay. I like that as an action item. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, I'll move on. We got a comment about solar, adding more language on solar and specifically address the Tesla solar roof product line. So I've included some of the recommended and not recommended treatments related to solar panels. And you can see we don't really go into any detail on specific product types, but really just trying to promote the use of low profile solar or placement on a rear elevation or a side elevation that doesn't have high visual impacts on the house. So these are just some examples I pulled online. If you have any examples in the neighborhood of homes with solar panels, please let me know and we can use those in the document. But
we're so heavily treed.
Yeah, I know, that's, yeah.
Not a great option for most of us.
And I don't know who this comment came from, but if anyone else had a comment about it, we can talk about it.
It seems inconsistent that we would say certain materials that stand out are not allowed, like TPO, but solar panels are.
Okay, well, we can take a look at, we obviously don't want to discourage, sustainable and green building practices. And I think we're encouraging people to find a solution for solar panels that don't visually impact the character of the house. Talking about the placement and not necessarily getting into detail on the, actual product.
So roofs in this neighborhood are a touchy point because they are wildly expensive, and TPO is one of the cheaper options that people can go with. It's also a solution for a problem that all of us have. That's why I think that talking about recommending certain roof materials and not others is probably not a good idea, especially if we're then going to come along and say that, oh, but solar's okay. TPO,
So Jenny,
one of the advantages of TPO is that it's reflective, right? So, I mean, it's also an energy conscious solution.
And, you know, on some buildings with flat roofs, it'll be appropriate, and on others, it might not be. And these are all discussions that any applicant who's proposing to make a change will have with the ARB when they go. I think someone else was chiming in. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I just wanted to say, I think this is one area where we ought to be very careful about limiting materials. First, because they're evolving so fast, but secondly, because I think we ought to focus really on the pitch, the overhangs, and things like that, rather than the materials.
I agree with what you just said. And also, I think that because this is evolving technology, we don't want to, you have to be broad and flexible. Recommending one product may not be a good idea, and in 10 years from now, it may not be the best idea.
So I want to give some examples from existing ARB cases that come in, just to kind of give a feasibility of how this process works using design guidelines. So in the Lorton Historic Overlay District, not really a historic overlay district, but treated as one with a memorandum of agreement, there are some solar panels installed within viewshed of historic sites. And it really didn't come down to what type of solar panel it was, but how it was installed and how intrusive it was from the viewshed. And the ARB members on Samantha and Kay, I don't know if you were here for this one, but it came down to what color the wiring casing was or something like that, so that it wouldn't be so visible from the historic structures. And like, once again, there's no solar panel discussion in the design guidelines for Lorton. So it came up as, how do we treat this? And we treat it just like any other architectural element that's there. On the materials discussion, we'll go back to the Secretary of Interior standards, as we're required in the zoning ordinance and the Secretary of Interior standards to state what kind of materials we recommend. And once again, I can't emphasize this enough, is the term recommendation. In the Centerville Historic Overlay District, another example, the home child care came in a historic home child care, but a child care center came in a historic structure. They wanted to replace the wood decking on the porch because they had children running around getting splinters and things like that. So it came up about, functionality and durability versus use, and then what it looked like historically. So what ended up happening with that one was the wood was recommended material, but the ARB ended up approving a Trex material, which is pressure treated and much more sustainable and durable. So even though it's recommended, that the first thing is to recommend using the same materials that we have that's existing, a lot of things go into determining factors, including durability, sustainability, cost. All those things have come in and been brought forth to the ARB as a discussion point. So really, this is really just a jumping off point to kind of start that. But if, like for the childcare example, they were able to successfully convince the ARB that the Trex was a better material in the long run because it kept the use of the childcare in that building and kept that building as it was and preserved the building. So, I mean, there's a cost and benefit, but that's all taken into account in the ARB kind of analysis and determination. And we do have 5 architects on the architectural review board that are currently practicing and give that advice and guidance to applicants that come in. So just because a material is listed in here doesn't necessarily, I know it's kind of off-putting, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the end all be all. Like solar panels weren't thought about when the design guidelines were last written in 1992. So here we are trying to interpret them and future materials to a modern day. So just wanted to give those kind of examples.
I personally think that the examples that you gave, especially picture 1 and picture 3, are appropriate. And I would say that in picture 2, that's not the type of solar panels we would want. My little bit of snarky side, by the way, is picture 1 and 3, in my mind, are still mid-century modern houses and would not pass our guidelines because of the roof pitch. But I just thought I'd throw that out there just for fun.
I think your example, Laura, speaks to the larger issue that I raised of, you know, there's a lot of ambiguity and unknowns when the answer coming out of, you know, recommended, not recommended seems very clear. And yet anytime we talk about it, you know, the reasoning is, well, but the ARB will interpret and there are exceptions. And how do we communicate that clearly and concisely to a neighborhood of how many homes, 200 some homes, who aren't going to read, you know, 100 pages and who won't always attend meetings and listen to all the cases. And then even if they did, still may not trust that I'm going to have to, you know, when I go to persuade the ARB, you know, I'll win and be able to make an affordable renovation or a renovation that's going to last. That's the challenge, right? Is that even though it says recommended, not recommended, right? We can't predict what the ARB is going to do. And what the HOD does is it introduces this layer where I now have to convince someone to make a change to my home that I want to make when I own it. And so the more that we can remove that barrier, the more on board I think people will get.
That's exactly right. And in addition to that, you already have large discussions going on among neighbors about moving to TPO for a lot of different reasons. And so when you don't recommend, or you say not recommended for a specific material that people are really interested in and moving toward, you're going to create a tremendous backlash because they're just not going to understand that the ARB can be persuaded, or they'll think that they don't need to, they shouldn't have to persuade the ARB.
Exactly.
That's what I'm really concerned about.
So my concern and what I'm hearing is that you don't want this extra regulation to preserve the houses.
No. That's not it. It's that we want extra regulation to preserve houses, but less preservation, right? We all of our conversations around when we were looking at the homes was we want freedom to innovate, freedom to be creative, and that doesn't seem to have been reflected in the guidelines. The guidelines are very, very specific. And while I understand that the ARB, you know, they need examples and things like that, this started with massing and it has just ballooned to cover literally door color, which like has been a point made by neighbors that, you know, and they've said, you know, oh, so what, they're going to tell me what color my door can be now? And we said, no, they can't regulate that. And it showed up in the guidelines and TPO and like these really specific things that just don't seem to be, they're not in the spirit of creativity and innovation and, you know, adapting your home to be easier to maintain. And that's where we think, like, we want the regulation, we want it for massing. We don't want, you know, really outrageous, outlandish things to happen here, but we need to rein it in. And so that's why I identified in my feedback, I think the root of all of these issues is the basis of them in the Secretary of the Interior guidelines. Because trying to keep the spirit of those is conflicting with the spirit of what we discussed in our conversations.
So Benny, can I'm going to provide like sort of devil's advocate sort of response to that. And I brought this up several months ago. If we believe that there's historical significance to the neighborhood that we want to preserve, we're going to have to offend a little and restrict a little. If we are just worried about mass and scale, that's a zoning issue that is not going to be addressed by a historic overlay district. So we have to figure out, I agree, we have to walk that line of what that means, but a historic overlay district means that we consider the historical value of these houses to be preserved as much as possible. And if we don't want to go down that path of describing what that means, then there's no reason to have a historic overlay district, and we need to do something different. So I'm just playing devil's advocate.
No, I agree with you, and I think you've hit it spot on. I'm starting to think that an HOD is not the right instrument for what we were trying to achieve, because if it has to look like this, then this is overkill.
Jenny, I don't think there's any other option that we have to preserve some of the things that we do all agree on other than the HOD. And I think the really simple thing to do here is to create a separate chapter where recommended stuff is, and distinguish that from the stuff that's really going to be a sticking point with the ARB. I mean, a lot of people will find value in recommendations, but you don't want to create the impression that the HOD is going to regulate materials that you use or colors that you use, because that's not really what's going on. So why can't we make that a separate chapter instead of weaving it in with some of the required stuff?
Well, that's what I suggested originally, but what I'm hearing coming out of that is that no, it's not possible, because the ARB is going to regulate your materials when you go to get a permit.
But that goes against what we were told from the beginning.
Exactly.
We were told that this is what makes it different from an HOA. An HOA can regulate things like materials and colors, but an HOD cannot. So that's what the whole neighborhood is expecting, that we're not regulating those kinds of things.
Right. They can't regulate. So let's be clear on that. They can't regulate. The problem is they can turn it into a long review process.
Right.
But they can't. It can turn into a very long process.
David has put something into the chat that I think is really helpful as a guideline for how to fix a lot of these issues. Just get less specific, right? He says here the Eichler overlay district in Palo Alto use roofing materials with a plain appearance that does not distract from the design of the residence. Right? That's simple, and you're relying on the interpretation of the ARB in that case, but it leaves open a lot of materials, and I think we'd get a lot less pushback if we removed the specific details that are all throughout this document and went with statements like that. And then that combined with the pictures, right, makes the point.
I hear what you're saying. The problem is the zoning ordinance, which is the regulatory document, prescribes what we have to analyze and put in the design guidelines. And the zoning ordinance specifically matches up with the Secretary of Interior standards. So if we don't provide that with the materials and all those things discussed earlier in the design guidelines, we are not meeting the zoning ordinance requirements of what should be looked at for recommendations in the design guidelines.
So can you separate out and create different chapters? Do the zoning ordinance, does it tell you how you have to format your document?
It tells you what you have to include, but I'm not sure. The issues here is the design guidelines are recommendations, and it leaves the wiggle room up to the Architectural Review Board to be able to make that. The ones in Palo Alto, it says 5-3-2. There could be 15 other regulations on there. I don't know Palo Alto specifically, but there could be 15 other recommendations in there that we're not calling out. So
I'll just add, I mean, like those design guidelines, they do call out example recommended materials. And I think that's what we're trying to get across, so that if you're an applicant looking to change your roof materials, you have an idea of the kind of materials that the ARB is going to look at and say, yes, this is compatible with the house, so that you don't have to go forward with something that's not compatible and that the ARB won't approve, and spend the time doing that.
What is the problem with TPO?
So and I have to look at the document. It might have been not recommended for highly visible and sloped roofs, like the bottom roof that you can see from the street. It would, the color and the materiality would, contrast with the historic character of the house and the houses surrounding it. For flat roofs, it's, used regularly and acceptable. But at the same time, it's a recommendation, and the ARB might review a TPO roof and find that it doesn't negatively impact the character and might approve it.
Because the thing is, a lot of these homes being a one-story house, you have, especially if it's been added onto, you have a lot more roof area, like square footage area to do than like a two-story house of the same size. So TPO ends up being way less expensive than like the other limited options that you have with a low slope roof. And a number of people have already used it in the neighborhood. I've never heard a single person complain about what it looks like.
Are you aware of the fact that it's becoming harder and harder to find a company to do a tar and gravel roof? There just aren't that many anymore, so it's not in their economic interest to do it. So that's why getting into these real specific recommendations really raises some eyebrows.
But guys, I think in general, what we're hearing here is that like when we raise objections like this, the response is, yeah, but it has to be that way because, which is why I'm coming to the conclusion that like it's either we don't like we just take our risks with developments, or we just overregulate this neighborhood.
Well, the thing is, think of the long-term implications of putting very strict recommendations and kind of impractical recommendations. Basically, people will say, wow, I can't afford to replace my roof, so I just won't do it because the money's not there. And then the house in general falls into a state of disrepair because people can't afford to do the needed maintenance. I mean, roof is a key feature of the house. It's very important to function. And then once the house becomes adequately, once it falls into adequate disrepair, it becomes adverse to the neighborhood. And then what happens? It qualifies to, it's no longer contributing, and it qualifies for being torn down eventually. I feel like we're going to lose our neighborhood by that pathway if we overregulate. And that's kind of counter to the whole purpose of the HOD.
Well, the roof has continued to be an object of discussion for a long time, and I generally agree with everybody in terms of we have to be practical about the roof and things like that. But I mean, I have a question for Lily. I hope Lily didn't step away because you kept off her camera. But the reality is there are Department of Interior and other regulations that establish HODs within the United States. Virginia has very few HODs. Fairfax County has very few, even more so. The question, I guess, for Lily is, in my mind, if we don't come to some sort of an agreement to at least establish guidelines to create an HOD and get approval for that, there is no way for us to really stop the size and height limitations just through a zoning change. And so I think we have to figure out that balance. But Lily, is that correct? There's no way we can't just go back and change the zoning for this neighborhood without some basis of a historic overlay district and why. Is that correct?
That is mostly correct. What this process does is it's going to include a rezoning component, which is going to rezone the specific neighborhood that we're talking about, basically change the zoning map to create an overlay district, which is the HOD. The underlying zoning district is R3 right now. So the development standards would be applicable.
Right. So you need the overlay basically in order to change.
Correct. There's no other zoning district, you can either down zone, you can ask to down zone to a more, higher number, R2, this is R3, so R2, R1, but there are other development standards that these properties may not meet. For example, the lot size is bigger in R2 and R1, but the height limit is the same. You'll have a a little bit more bigger setback, but there also needs to be, in addition to meeting the minimum development standards for the other zoning districts, it's gonna need to have a nexus as to why you're doing that. The nexus here is the historic overlay, because you want to protect these historic structures or resources. So the most appropriate path, I think, is the historic overlay district. There's no other rezoning that you can apply to protect the structures, basically.
And we need the guideline. We need the guidelines, because without guidelines, we have nothing that we're defining.
Correct.
So,
and we specifically did not and do not recommend putting in the materials, the colors, and all those recommendations that you see in the design guidelines. We can't add them in the zoning ordinance because it would be really hard to regulate. But with the these features being included in the design guidelines, like Sarah and Laura mentioned, that would be something applicants will work with the ARB to make it work for the, case by case. Whatever we put in the zoning ordinance will be applicable to all properties within that HOD.
all right, okay.
And to your point, Patrick, the zoning ordinance only gives you the buildable area, like a box, if that makes sense, like a 3D structure of where you can, the envelope, the building envelope. So if massing is the issue, that's something you want to further define in the recommendations, because we can't necessarily say, okay, the first, and I'm just making this up, but the first floor has to be 30 feet and the second floor has to be set back 35 feet. That's not something we could necessarily do in the zoning ordinance. So it just gives you the building envelope and then the restrictions on the design and everything else. That's where we're kind of going with that. So that's why you would at least need the recommendations to further define the character and architecture.
Can I say something?
Sure.
A couple of comments. Gravel driveways have been mentioned, are mentioned in the guidelines. There isn't a single driveway in the Holmes and Acres that is gravel. That's just a totally impractical.
There is.
In this area, you can't. My kids in Los Angeles have gravel driveways, but there is no snow. Here, if you want to cause yourself a whole bunch of trouble, put in your gravel driveway. So let's not even mention that.
There is actually a gravel driveway. The former president of the Holmes Run Civic Association has one on Executive Drive.
Oh, maybe there's one. Okay, but that's not historic. That's probably been put in. Also, built-up roofing, like as Keith said, that's an obsolete technology. In my practice, and I closed my office 4 years ago, but in last 20 years, we didn't put in a single built-up roof because that's just not what's being done these days. And so if anybody wants it, fine, but that certainly shouldn't be a priority. There are so many much better materials for low slope roofs, and they should be allowed because they don't detract from the character of the community. Let's face it, people want less trouble. Built-up roof is nothing but trouble. If you want to have a forest growing on your roof, go for it.
Should we have a focused meeting on just roofs, because there are so many issues around roofs that maybe we just need a single meeting to figure out the guidelines on the on roofs, because I agree. But trust me, once this gravel roof is off my house, it is never going back up. I will state that publicly. But there are other issues about roofs that are, I posted one in the public, chat, but maybe we should just have a single focused effort around talking about roofs and what do we really want the guidelines to say, so that we can kind of get through the rest.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
It might be helpful for us if you have specific house examples that have recently, replaced their roof. We're open to those examples and, taking a look and discussing it further. So
I replaced mine in March and I almost went with TPO, but instead I went with ModBit, which was actually quite a bit more expensive. So
I have a copper roof behind mine, not on my house, but behind mine, and I love looking at it.
yeah, the metal roofs in this neighborhood also look fantastic. I think, Patrick, I don't think we need a meeting. I think we're all in agreement, right? Slope and overhangs are the thing to regulate here. Materials are not.
I have a problem with slope, but you saw that in the chat.
Defining a specific slope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, part of our charge with the design guidelines is looking at trends and characteristics that are existing now. So that's what we're responding. And I understand the goal to have ingenuity and to be flexible and things like that. But maybe it's something where we go back and we can work with tracers on this, as I hear that the materials become the major issue and the calling out of specific materials is the issue. So maybe we go back to something like we did for the recommended and not recommended, where we say, recommended materials, and then not necessarily be silent, but generalize it. Because I'm hearing that, it's the concern about the limitation of the specific materials of this. And the problem, this is why this is so difficult for all of us, is, architecture is subjective. And, you looking at it, me looking at it, we have 20 people in the meeting, and everybody looking at it could come up with a different interpretation of whether it's okay or not. So we're trying to navigate that. So appreciate the discussion on it. Let us go back and give a little more thought to that, the materials especially, and try to reword it, because, we want to allow that flexibility. And I don't think the intent, and it's hard because, it's design guidelines or recommendations, but I understand by putting them into print, it's creating a limitation on it, right? Whether you say it's recommended or not recommended. So I hear that. Let us go back, and Sarah, I appreciate all the discussion, but Sarah, if you could go to the next item. I know some of them are we've kind of talked about all of them almost, it seems like, at this point. But Sarah, if you could go to the next item. I just want to make sure we're at 8 o'clock right now. I want to reserve at least 5 minutes or so at the end. Oh, here we go.
This is related. So we're continuing roofs.
There we go.
I'm just gonna say to begin with, we don't prescribe. We're not being prescriptive. We're not talking about specific roof slopes. I included like a diagram of roof pitches for discussion. But here are some of the images of recommended and not recommended roof forms. But I'll open it up to your comments and thoughts on this.
This one's an interesting one for me, because so we talk about design and trends. And I posted in the group chat that the trend has been on some of the attachments, the roof lines are not staying within that 112, 212, 312 pitch. And so the question becomes, do we want the pitch to be standard on the bulk of the structure, and allow some differences? Because I started walking again because I've gotten fat during COVID, but walking through the neighborhood, the trend right now is we're exceeding on the attachments on the houses. We're exceeding the 212, 312, but it still is not detracting from the fact that it is a Holmes Run acre house. It's not the whole roof line that's gone to, 412, or I don't know if there's 512s that I've seen, but and we'll just call them out. It's Wade. Wade is adding attachments to plenty of houses that have a higher pitch than the 312. And if it's not overwhelming the entire structure, do we care? I mean, so that's the dialogue I want to introduce there, because I still recognize them as a mid-century modern house. That's part of the neighborhood. But if we're going to take one attachment or one extension of the house and say that roof line is not conforming to our standards, or our guidelines, I should say, then I'm starting to have a problem with that, because I'm okay with the trend of what Wade's doing. I know Edith hates them. Edith's not on the Defender stuff, but I know she hates them. But I don't mind them at all. And I still recognize the houses as Holmes Run acre homes, because the entire house has not changed its pitch.
The problem is I recognize them as HRA homes with a Wade Heron addition. And to me, it's visually distracting because it's clearly not like true to the original designs of the homes. It is clearly a Wade Heron addition. And so it is to me, it's a detractor visually. It's very obvious to me. I'm not an architect. I don't have any background in this stuff, but it's very obvious.
Is it?
So that's been the age-old question. Do you still consider it a mid-century modern house, or do you not? And I would tell you that architects would tell you it's still a mid-century modern house.
But remember, we're not trying to define mid-century modern. We're trying to define Holmes Run acres.
So
no, I get that.
And to that point, we want to make sure that we're telling the whole story of Holmes Run acres, right? So the evolution of Holmes Run acres. So if there's a trend with a specific architect, that also tells the story of Holmes Run acres.
He's not an architect, though. He's a contractor.
Oh, okay. Sorry, contractor.
Yeah.
The additions.
We overqualified him.
But my thought on this one, and maybe we can introduce this language and see how that works, is, and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, something about putting in the language that the primary roof, or the majority of roof shall be the low pitch from 1 to 312, and that the additions or whatever. So this is what happened. If these additions came in, right, with this crazy pitch roof, I'm assuming the ARB, and we have two architects that are here tonight on the ARB, would say, ooh, that's a little steep. Can you mitigate that? I'm just ad-libbing here, but can you mitigate that? Can you change the slope of the roof so that it's not as drastic? That's the kind of discussions that are going to happen. It's not going to be, no, you can't do it, but it's going to be, okay, I see where you're going with this. The neighborhood usually has lower sloped roofs, or shallower sloped roofs. Can we mitigate that a little bit? And then if they come back and say, we need it to be 512 because of drainage issues, or we want it to be 512 because of whatever reason, the ARB would analyze that and discuss that as part of their argument about whether they think that's appropriate for this. So yeah, but anyway, is that something like the primary roof or the majority of the roof, or I don't know if we want to get as prescriptive as percentage of the roof, because I don't think we want to go that far, but I guess primary roof slope shall be 1 to 12 to 312 or something like that. But we can come up with some more. But the issue is everything's up for discussion, but then we have to leave it at some point where the ARB takes it to further discussion, right? So we kind of have to set this up for them about what are our make or break points, and then we let the ARB kind of deliberate on that. So I hear materials being an issue, roof slope, that type of thing. So any comments?
I just want to point out that you're very likely to eventually get someone coming to the ARB saying, I need to change to a 412 so that I can put shingles on this thing so that I can afford to re-roof it. Because when you go to a 412, suddenly shingles are possible and it gets way cheaper. Like it is 75% cheaper to re-roof your house. So are they going to be okay with economic need?
That's something that comes up. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's something that comes up. I mean, there's nothing off the I've heard the gambit of, you know, I always go back to slate roofs, because slate roofs are just a good example in preservation of how cost prohibitive things are sometimes. And if you've ever worked with the City of Alexandria Historic Review Board, sometimes they mandate slate roofs on some of their older structures. So good thing we're not in Alexandria. But to that point, if it becomes cost prohibitive, and you won't be able to make the change, the bottom line is still your property. We're just trying to guide you and give you guidance on the direction of how to best do that. So if the slope of 412 is needed, is it landscaping or an addition or the color of the shingles, or, you know, I don't know. And I'm not an architect, so I can't really offer that, but some other sort of mitigation that can offset the proposed potential negative impact of a 512 roof or something like that. But that's where that discussion would probably go at the ARB from what I've seen.
One thing that's interesting is, so I just looked at my neighbor's addition, and the addition is actually a 312 pitch. The reason it looks sharper is it's because it's on the front of the house, but it is actually a 312 pitch. And I'm hearing some people on the phone don't like that type of an addition because it's not in keeping with the lines of the Holmes run acre perceived what the footprint and house should look like.
How do you know it's a 312 pitch? Did they tell you?
I'm looking at it right now. It's right next door to me, and I can tell you it's a 312 pitch. You know,
yeah,
what
but
I
had roofers come by who told me they couldn't tell what my pitch was from just looking at it, and they're roofers.
But because all of ours for the most part are 312 in this neighborhood, and so it's exactly the same pitch as the rest of the house. It's just on the front of the house, which matches the pitch of the back of the house, and it looks funny to some people, but the pitch is correct. You can actually estimate about a 112, 212, 312 visually. So it's a 312, but it's the extension beyond the footprint that bothers people, and that's where in my mind we have to be careful about how we perceive what these houses are supposed to look like, you know, historically or moving forward, because they were designed to be expanded.
I thought that the pitch of the roofs was something we agreed was a character defining feature of the houses.
We did.
So, you know, I think if
did.
you regulate pitch, you will regulate materials by necessity. Just like Jenny was saying, you can't really put
You won't regulate pitch. It's a guideline. You will provide a guideline on pitch. You won't regulate.
Okay, forget the word regulate. Let's put in whatever equivalent word is what the ARB is really doing. Recommend. But you know, if we de-recommend certain pitches, I think we do lose a pretty character defining feature of the HRA homes.
Yeah, I don't really see a way around this.
I agree with you to a certain extent. And I say to a certain extent because there are changes that are necessary when you expand these houses. And there are guidelines, like I said, that we are going to develop, but they're just that, they're guidelines. I mean, I'll be honest with everybody on the phone. When I'm seeing some of the additions and changes that people are making to their houses that still feel in line for me as being mid-century modern and in keeping with the neighborhood, and I look at some of the guidelines, I'm backing away from my approval on this because we have to allow progress. This goes back to the whole discussion about the roofs and the materials. We have to allow progress, but still stay in keeping. And the question has always been, what are we protecting? Are we protecting these buildings to be the same old buildings that they always were? Or are we protecting a character? And I believe we're protecting a character. We're not protecting my bread box house that is never going to have a good front side appeal to it because it looks like a bread box. And I want to make some additions to the house. And I'm not talking like square footage, but I do want to add some architectural interesting components to the house that I don't think should be in the guidelines. So I just want us to be very careful on, walking that line between, if anybody's been to Shenandoah, they can't touch any of the cabins at Lewis Mountain, and they will fall to the ground the way that they were built. That's not the intention for Homes Run Acres. So we have to just figure out, what we're really protecting. And in my mind, we're protecting an example of mid-century modern, of modest scale and size. We're not protecting what was in 1953.
But we just judged all the houses in our neighborhood based on what is easily recognizable as an HRA house, not what is considered mid-century modern. I mean, we just esteemed a bunch of houses not contributing for that reason.
Not everybody judged it that way. There are plenty of houses in the neighborhood that have been stoned over with, stone on the outside and everything that still met the cut because we liked the houses in the neighborhood. So no, we didn't necessarily vote it that way. We said it was contributing because, and it wasn't solely on, is it a Homes Run recognizable house? Some of them, we said, yeah, we could recognize the original structure in the middle of what's been increased, and we accepted them.
So I'm trying to circle back on this a little bit, where the original comment was, cite a maximum roof pitch angle. And from what I'm hearing, because of different opinions, we probably don't want to do that. We kind of want to say, and it goes back to, putting a number in makes it so definitive as, is it over 412 or under 412? Whereas we say we recommend the low pitch roof and we don't recommend over 412, right? Because 412 is pushing it. So, and that's what I think I'm hearing. And once again, it's subjective, up to interpretation, but that's what the guidelines are supposed to say is generally through the neighborhood. When the houses were developed, they had this low pitch roof. So, that would be our recommendation. And then if for whatever reason we needed a higher pitch roof and the applicant could justify why they would need that, the ARB can say, yep, I hear that. But part of the HOD regulation is you're kind of ceding that control a little bit to the Architectural Review Board and their interpretation on it. So, yeah.
I think we all agreed that the Swiss Chalet was not the pitch that we wanted.
Right.
I think
right.
It becomes very difficult at a 412, and maybe in some cases, maybe in a 512, but probably not. But no, I agree. I think we all agree. The Swiss Chalet is not the roof line that goes with the neighborhood.
Is there in the document we can distinguish between the pitch of the roof and the materials of the roof?
Yeah.
That to me is the distinction, that the pitch is so much more important than the materials. And if we can make that distinction, and that goes to other sections too, if we can distinguish between really primary guidelines and secondary guidelines, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, I like that point. I agree with that. I like what you just said.
No, clearly the pitch of the roof is very, very important. That's really a key, one of the key guidelines, in my opinion. If we start changing the pitch of the house, that becomes a totally different ballgame.
Maybe the thing to do is have 3 sections. This sounds ridiculous, but have 3 sections for each, portion of the document where we have, HRA defining, which are the things that we agreed these are defining features of HRA, and these are kind of non-negotiable. We can talk about how vague to be there. And then we have recommended, and then under the not recommended, we're super vague and don't mention any materials.
By the way, our pitch is 2.5 and 12. That's the original house.
It varies across houses, actually.
No, it does not.
Well,
I have done 7 additions, 7 remodeling jobs, and it does not change from house to house. They were all made on the same pattern. Now, maybe some people have changed it, but the original house has 2.5 and 12.
So
2
DBS
stories or
told
1
me-
story.
DBS told me they're between 2 and 3.5 in this neighborhood.
Well, DBS may not have measured all of them.
Well,
You know, they're
and
just
another
contractors will tell you anything. I have drawings. I have the original drawings.
And this is another reason why not to include a specific number, right? Because we want to allow that flexibility and to let that go. So, okay, heard. Slope is more important than materials on roofing. We will work on that.
I just want to say one last thing here. You know, we talk a lot about how much we really want to regulate, even not regulate, but how we all agree that we really want to limit massing and building height if it's possible, but it's not really possible. Well, having a high pitch roof really makes the building look a lot taller, and it blocks your sight line to the vegetation behind the house. My next door neighbor has a high pitch roof, and I'm telling you, it totally changes the house. It makes it taller and prouder. So
right,
I
but you can regulate. If we have a historic overlay district, the zoning will change to keep the height restriction lower than 3 stories, like the, whatever that thing is up at the top of the road. So that'll change the zoning. The HOD will change the zoning for things like that.
Maybe part of the issue here is that we're looking right now at just the guidelines, and we haven't seen the things we really want to see in a change in the zoning ordinance. Can we see the change in the zoning ordinance? Because if people could see that, maybe they'd be more willing to accept this.
And here's what I'm saying is that the change in the zoning ordinance can only be in the building envelope. Okay, so it's not going to tell you the roof slope. It's not going to tell you the first floor setback versus the second floor setback, which are the character defining features of the neighborhood. We can show you, and maybe the next meeting, some examples of the proposed Holland Hills language, but it is very vague and left vague on purpose. I think the only change, and Lily, correct me if I'm wrong, was we said that non-residential structures were going to be 35 feet, less than 35 feet, because Holland Hills had a special thing where they had towers on some of their houses that were contributing features. So we didn't specifically want to limit the height on those. But the zoning ordinance, like, for example, fences, we can't regulate fences in the zoning ordinance because there's no building permit required for a fence to be put in, and same with sheds unless it's under a certain size. So we're restricted in the zoning ordinance of what we can regulate. And so
the only thing, Laura,
yes.
The only thing really that I believe that the zoning, the HOD overlay, I think the only impact that it would have is on the 35-foot front. I think that's the only thing, because the houses in this neighborhood as a historic overlay district do not tend to be, except for the one exception in the neighborhood, that it's 30, more, at 35 feet. But I believe that's the only facet of the zoning that would actually change.
And the main part of the zoning is enacting the ARB review of building permits and approval of building permits and signage and review of site plans and rezonings. That's the overlay, historic overlay district enactment. And then if you want those more specific features and we can defend them, that's the other problem, is we have to be able to defend them. It just is so limiting, which is why the design guidelines are so important. It's because the zoning ordinance doesn't limit architectural features and defining characteristics, or very rarely is able to. So I hear that. We can provide you with a straw man at one of our future meetings of kind of what's in the zoning ordinance. But from the two that we've worked on so far, Wellington River Farm and Holland Hills, we've elected to keep it more broad on purpose because it's like we had talked about, if you go at 31% front yard coverage, you have to ask for a variance to be able to do that for whatever reason. There's no wiggle room whatsoever. But it's a fine line, and I hear all the concerns. So let us, I'll put that on the list of things to bring back at a future meeting of the zoning ordinance provisions. But the basic outline as they stand now is purpose, significance, and then the underlying zoning district, which is R3. So I'm sorry, what'd you say, Lily?
No, go ahead.
No, but the underlying zoning district, which is R3, and defers to those. So it's not, unless, like I said, the buildings, the heights and the setbacks are something we can regulate, but not necessarily the architecture, which is why the design guidelines are so paramount and included in the historic overlay district documents that we have to create. So.
And to add to what Laura said, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Lily.
I was going to say, to add to what Laura just mentioned, what we did for the Holland Hills, for example, in the R1, R2, R3, R4 zoning districts, the 35-foot height limit is only for detached single-family residences or dwellings. All other structures that are permitted by right or by special exception or special permit could go up to 60 feet. So what we did is limit the height within that neighborhood where the HOD is being established to be a maximum of 35 feet for all structures. What this does is it would limit, and in this case, similar to the Holland Hills, it's a well-established neighborhood that's fully developed, so there are the potential of having other than single-family detached dwellings is very low, but it would limit the height limit to 35 feet and would also give that flexibility. For example, if there are properties that have different slopes and may need to go up to the 35 feet, let's say it is a downsloping lot and it needs to go up to 35 feet, but it would have minimal impact as viewed from the public right-of-way, for example, that 35-foot height envelope would allow that. If we do go down and limit the height substantially or very different from the underlying zoning district, it wouldn't allow this flexibility. However, having the guideline, what it does is it will work with the applicant to make it consistent with the neighborhood and the adjacent properties.
So I pulled up just for an example, and this is an old version, so I apologize. I don't want to release the new version until we get closer to being done with it. But this is basically a straw man of what the zoning ordinance section for Holmes Run Acres would look like. We have a district-specific purpose. We have permitted special exceptions, special permit uses, which would all remain the same under your R3 zoning. That would not be changed with this. And then the additional standards and the building height is where the meat of our changes could be if we wanted to do that. So you can see here the additional standards. One of them is that one of them is A or B review, and the other one is compatible with the Holland Hills design guidelines. So that's going to be part of the zoning ordinance. But if this would be the part where we would add the setbacks, if we felt like the setbacks needed to be regulated further or the front yard coverage needed to be put in, and we would craft the language to put that in. The issue is that we have to be able to justify and say, 95%, I don't know what, I'm just making up a percentage, but the majority of the houses in the neighborhood have a front yard coverage of 25%. Therefore, we feel like this is relevant to the character of the district to be able to limit this to 25%. So you go ahead. I know someone's trying to.
Just to clarify, this is Lily. This is a draft, an older draft, and that's why you see that the ARB will review fences. That's actually, the ARB will review fences if it's part of a larger project that requires building permit. The ARB's purview is tied to the building permit. So we would have recommendations in the design guidelines, but we can't, basically this zoning ordinance amendment of creating the HOD does not give the ARB additional authority that it already does not have. So they will be able to look at it as part of the overall design of the property, but let's say a fence by itself without a building permit requirement would not be subject to ARB review.
I think I heard, Laura, in what you said earlier, and correct me if I misunderstood or misinterpreted what you said, but I kind of heard a hint that if it's not, we don't want to put it in the zoning ordinance because the zoning ordinance is super restrictive. So everything that's not in the zoning ordinance, let's put in the HOD guidelines. But I think what we're saying as a neighborhood is there are some things that we don't want anyone to be able to tell us what to do with. So like fences, housing colors, or housing, front doors, roof materials, that sort of thing. And I understand, okay, there's a restriction on what has to be in there because of the Secretary of the Interior guidelines and what the zoning ordinance says has to be in the HOD. But like fences, we don't have to go get a permit to get one. Why does that need to be in there? Front door color, why does that have to be mentioned, right? Like, and I think anything that we can take out, let's take it out. And if it, even if, according to the zoning ordinance, it has to be in there for some reason, like roof materials, let's separate it out into different sections so that it's really clear that, okay, here's what we recommend for you, but the ARB is not going to touch this.
Yes, and thank you for that, Jenny. It's the clarification of the distinction of the threshold of why it's coming to the ARB in the first place. So it's coming to the ARB because it needs a building permit or it needs a site plan. And then with that, that's when it comes into review. And we're still trying to figure out the nuances of this, but I understand the concern about the door color. That's not something that would require a building permit. But maybe we, as you suggested, kind of pull those back a little bit on, if it comes in for a building permit, the ARB can have a comment on the color of the door if they really want to. But I mean, I guess you guys want a fuchsia pink door, that type of thing, there's like color palette and things like that might come into play. But even if we don't put it in the recommendations, the ARB could still comment on it. But I hear about putting it in writing ahead of time and the limiting factor of that.
I think what people want to know is what's going to hold up my permit and what's not.
So and I know we're past time, so I apologize, but I appreciate this discussion and I think it's important. The ARB, the thing that really is going to hold up your permit is when you submit it and when you can get in front of the ARB. The ARB discussion, you submit your materials ahead of time. The ARB comes prepped with questions about what to ask you. We can, and when like myself or my colleagues review the application, we'll give you a heads up of, oh gosh, this might not work. We had someone just come in last week about some brick gate posts that were 10 to 12 feet in height that were just not going to fly. So, things like that we can kind of talk with you through the process. You're not meant to go out there on your own and just thrown in front of the ARB to get, ripped apart. That's not the intent at all. We can work with you on that, and it's just a matter of that extra review time. And because the ARB only meets once a month, if you submit the day after the ARB meeting, it's going to hold you up a month because of the fact that the ARB just doesn't meet again and you're required to get their review or approval. Go ahead.
What's going to hold up my permit in terms of like not getting it approved? Because I know they can't reject it, but they will just not approve it. And so if I come in with a design that has a 12 and 12 roof pitch, they're not going to approve my permit. But on the other hand, if I come in with a fuchsia pink door, whatever, they're still going to approve my permit. And right now it's not clear in the guidelines that one will and one won't, because they look exactly the same.
Right. I hear your point about the primary versus secondary and tertiary kind of, you know, the roof pitch is the most important, right? Like what's our major concerns and as opposed to paint color, you know, or material, right? Like that, and I hear that, and I think we can make that more clear in the design guidelines. I see that it's all, you know, not monotone, but, you know, all on the same level of importance. I understand and I hear that. I think we can modify that in the design guidelines.
I have one other suggestion in terms of helping sell this to the community. As I think Jenny mentioned, the document is overwhelming. But I think it would help a lot if you had an executive summary, because that's what people are going to read. And the executive summary will also help to pull out the really important stuff.
Yeah.
If you can do that, it should help.
I agree, Keith.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think we might have done that for Holland Hills once we get a little further along. But yes, that's a good point. We can definitely do that. Create the, like I said, primary, secondary issues, and go from there on. You know, trying to figure out what's a non-starter, right, for each project, and what there's some wiggle room and what there's kind of like, yeah, we're not going to go there. So I hear that. Okay. I know it's 8:35. I know we didn't get through all of our comments for tonight, but what I would recommend, if you haven't yet, I know the design guidelines are very long, but please forward, and this is not the last time we will review them by any means, please. This is the very first blush at them, and I appreciate all the comments and discussion on it. So I think that we would appreciate more comments at this point. The good news with Homes Run Acres is we've got the consultants on early, so we're able to make these discussions go in and have a lot more discussions. Homes Run Acres, they came in a little bit later, so we just had a little bit different process at that point. So I think that will we've got some good comments for tonight, and I do want to touch base on next steps. I don't need to necessarily pull up my PowerPoint for this and next meetings. So I am still in the process of hiring a couple additional planners for our group. We are looking to internally start reviewing this application, which means taking it to pre-staffing internally, where we ask other internal Fairfax County agencies if they have any concerns. So we'll consult with transportation, we'll consult with urban forestry, schools, specifically because Woodlawn School, is it Woodlawn? I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the school, but the if is it Woodlawn? I'm sorry,
Woodburn.
I'm sorry, Woodburn. I'm stuck in Mount Vernon, I apologize. Woodburn School. And also, for example, the Park Authority, because there's Park Authority on property in this neighborhood. So we'll start that consulting in the next kind of couple of weeks here, get those comments in and start bringing them back to you all. That'll inform the boundaries and properties that would be included in the proposed district. And then I'm hoping to pick up work group meetings again in September. I will give you some dates once we get closer in. But once again, I'm trying to hire some additional help so that we can get this back on track with the schedule. I'm anticipating we'll have more work groups. We need to go through each street. I think we only went through the first batch when the last meeting with Nicole was here. So we need to go through those, the contributing, non-contributing properties. And so I'm assuming the next meeting or two will be on those as we make changes to design guidelines. And then we'll come back at a separate point at another meeting with Sarah and Traceries and give you a revised draft of design guidelines for more review and discussion. But I will tell you the project, Holland Hills actually got deferred yesterday and not authorized at the Board of Supervisors. So that project is now going to be delayed as well. So we'll just see how we are here moving forward. So
Hey, Laura.
yes.
Without discussion, can you just take a quick note, because it was up on the screen, that 35 foot that's allowed for R3 zoning in our neighborhood is problematic. If you could just take a note and discuss, because that has to be changed. Otherwise, the overall characteristics of the neighborhood is shot if we don't deal with that 35 foot. That's in the R3 zoning right now. That's part of what. So just take a note. Sorry about that.
No.
Sure.
No, sure thing. We'll look at that further analysis of the characteristics of the neighborhood. We got to deep dive into some of that. We haven't gotten that far, and that's why we're having all these discussions to figure out what we need to provide further information for, and possibly limit that in the zoning ordinance. So yeah, we'll do some further analysis on that. Okay. All right. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And if you have any comments on design guidelines, if you want to email them to the group or have specific items, we'll do a meeting summary of tonight and work with traceries on making some of those modifications. And thank you everybody for the discussion. I really appreciate it. This is not an easy process, but I'm optimistic we can come to some good resolutions and modifications of the design guidelines to get this moving forward. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a good rest of the night, and we'll see you hopefully in September sometime. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
Lily and Kira and Grace, do you all want to hop on a oh, Grace I think left, hop on a Teams chat real quick, and then we can.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay, Lily, if you would start one, I'll be there in just a second. Kira, just make sure you save save all of our save our recording and wherever on your computer.
Yes.